is 2B4.
Wow.
Boy, are we lucky today or what?
Wow, a lot of generous folks today. Kettle Moraine Natural History Association will donate $15,000 to the Kettle Moraine State Forest Southern Unit to be used to offset the purchase of a T650 Bobcat compact track loader.
We did extend the related to harvest management regulations 18E proposed request adoption of emergency board order. Our next item on our agenda is 2B5 request adoption of emergency board order FH01-18E proposed rules affecting chapters NR 20 and 25 related to harvest management regulations in the Lake Superior fishery. We do have citizen participation on this, and for the benefit of our audience, we did extend the period of time for public participation and input from last Friday to Monday at noon per request. So we're happy to do that, and we're pleased that a number of folks did make additional comments for us. So 2B5. Scott Lumens.
Well, thank you and good morning, Mr. Chair, Deputy Secretary, and members of the board. I'll jump right in with a quick history on the agenda item that we've got today. So the Voight case and final judgment or resolution of the lay of the land in the ceded territories, this is going back to 1991 and earlier, did not resolve issues related to Lake Superior. So at that time, the court allowed the parties, DNR, Bad River, and Red Cliff, to enter into a mutual agreement not to litigate. So we've done that. We've done a series of those. So these are similar to settlement negotiations in that, we're not litigating, we're doing this instead. So as such, they are party to party or government to government in this case, and they are confidential. So the agreement was not a rule process, and that's one thing that, is different for our staff and different for the public too. I know people are accustomed to a series of like 30 Dear Trustee rule hearings over a 2-year period or 72 counties on a spring hearing question. So that's the way, that's the way we usually do business. We like doing business with people that way, sitting at the table with the people who will be impacted. And so I just wanted to offer that background on why this process was different, because I know that many members of the public are sensitive to that. So, and even though the stakeholders are not able to participate directly in discussions, the department, as a representative of the state, we did communicate prior to going into these negotiations with our stakeholders, and we've worked with them continuously, in other ways, and I'll have a slide about that coming up. Just a little bit more on the process. I'll mention that each party had a negotiating team, so we had decision makers, we had legal staff, we had issue experts, and then backing up the negotiating teams that each party had, we had a party of experts, basically technical experts. They were law enforcement, biologist staff, and they provided the analysis and feedback to the negotiating team on the proposals that were being discussed. So that is the background. Talk a little bit about engagement with people, and actually covering the rule may not take as long to discuss as the background that we've already gone over. So we are working on a Lake Superior fishing agreement at this time. So we've been communicating with our stakeholders at that, throughout that. There we go. Of course, we communicate with the Lake Superior Commercial Fishing Board. We have biannual meetings with our constituents in the area. And, one thing I really should point out, we do have, we received a letter from one of our prominent stakeholder groups prior to going into negotiations. They gave us a list of 6 points that were very important to them. And so the first 2 are covered in this rule. They talked about the importance of the current refuge system to the health of the fishery. So I'll have a slide on that later, but those refuges will remain the same. They talked about the need and the benefit of adequate net-free sport fishing areas, and I'll cover that in the next slide too. I think we did an excellent job at preserving those areas for our sport anglers. And they had 4 other items, and we covered those in the agreement, which is not on the agenda, so I'll avoid diving into those today, but I wanted to relay that I think we did a really good job, our negotiators did a really good job of covering all of those points. And, maybe one other point is commercial fishers are one stakeholder group. I know anglers, we can be sensitive about who's getting more attention in these. And point out that the tribal interests are primarily commercial fishing, so it's almost unavoidable that these rules are going to talk about commercial fishing a lot. But I know that our staff work very closely with anglers, and they would say they work probably more closely with anglers than with commercials. It's not as visible. They don't have a board where you see some of that. So I just offer that as background. And then I can jump into the rule recommendations. The one I go right to is that third bullet, lake trout allocations. So the overall lake trout quota will stay the same. What the allocation will be changing, and I think that's going to be something that our commercials and our anglers are going to appreciate a lot. That's a 1,300 fish increase in the Apostle Islands area, which is really that popular sport fishing and commercial area. So that will, for instance, that will help avoid things like early season closures. That's a highlight I like to jump right to. That's gear use and marking. New requirements for marking that gear for use of it, and that will result in better enforcement down the road as well. Let's see. And I guess I'll mention most of the refuges and restricted areas remain the same. I'll get to another slide on that. October whitefish season, a 5-year season. You'll see the season dates for that in this rule order. And so there are associated things that are part of the agreement, and maybe I'll cover those later in questions. But just for now, there is an October whitefish season. That would be new. Let's jump right into those restricted and refuge areas. And so I don't know if I've got a pointer on this. That's okay, I won't risk it. But so you'll see the Devil's Island Fish Refuge up there and Gull Island Fish Refuge up there. Those are just closed to fishing, so those will remain the same. All of our stakeholders had said those are important to us for maintaining the fishery for sustainability. You'll see closer to the mainland there, you'll see the yellow island there. Let's see, Minnesota boundary Iron River is one. That's called a restricted area. You'll see Iron River going out towards Cranberry River, and
you got a pointer, Scott?
I think is the top one a pointer.
Here?
Yep.
Right here? And then here, huh?
Yeah, I don't think that pointer is working. I can't see it.
Just a bad shot.
Am I colorblind?
Yes.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Oh, there it is.
There
There it goes. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Laurie.
Yep, so we've got restricted areas there, going out there, and then Van Tassels. Todd, are there any more in there that I should be showing?
Chequamegon Bay.
Oh, okay, yep, Sandcut, Chequamegon Bay. One of the other maps I had had that more yellow, but so vast majority of those restricted areas will remain in place. And I should mention, sometimes we call them sport fishing restricted areas, and people think, oh, we can't sport fish in there. Those are actually, so the sport anglers can fish everywhere but in those 2 refuges. What's restricted in those areas is commercial fishing. So there's either no commercial fishing allowed or nets only at a certain depth so that they're not interfering with sport anglers. So those are basically sport fishing areas. And the vast majority of them stay the same. Again, I'll point out, it was one of the top priorities for our state anglers. The exceptions are, we've got two new ones. Sand Cut, is that the one in red? And so that would be open to commercial fishing. And so that would be a reduction. You can see the line on the north is the border of the restricted area. But that 6 mile long area of Sand Cut would now be open to commercial fishing, both state and tribal. And then the blue area, Van Tassels, would be open to tribal commercial fishing, but not state. So those definitely are, two things that I know we've been hearing about from our constituents. And I just wanted to point out, kind of relative to the rest of Lake Superior up there, how big those areas are. I recognize those are valuable sport fishing areas to our anglers, and obviously the tribes were very interested in fishing those areas as well. But that gives you a kind of a scale of what happened there. And I'll point out that, these were negotiations too. So I mean, people would have to have expected that we were going to give up something. I think I missed, and that's a good time to mention one other point. I know the question comes up, why did it take 4 years? I had been saying 3, and then I was reminded that it was actually, we're going on 4 years now of negotiations in order to get to an agreement like this. And I guess the answer to that is that we were starting over. We weren't bound by the previous agreement. The tribes really wanted to, the parties really wanted to start fresh. So it's not like we were just revising the previous agreement. And then it's true that both parties came to the table with pretty much opposing views on, I was going to say some issues just to downplay it, but I was reminded it was actually most issues at the start of the process. So those teams did work very hard. They were face-to-face negotiations. Our people made the long drive up to Ashland many times, and they both parties worked very hard at it, and in order to get back to the middle, which is where we are today, and they were able to do it. Okay, and I guess I predicted we'd spend less time talking about the rule than the background. I think I've hit the highlights of it. We've got definitions and things like that in there as well. There is an area along the Bad River and, let's see, in Red Cliff tribal lands where our state commercial fishers would not be able to fish, but that won't impact sport anglers at all, and I haven't heard that come up very much. And so that's basically the quick summary. I know when we get into questions, I'd point out that I do have Todd Kalish is here. He was part of the negotiating team. I wasn't. That's probably why I got the pick today, so I wouldn't talk about the negotiations. But overall, I guess just to wrap it up, so none of the regulations in this rule package will apply to sport anglers. We understand that they're sensitive to what goes on in the commercial fishing world, but just highlight that there's nothing new for our sport anglers in here. We've got an agreement that is respectful of the interests of both parties and preserves the fishery in Lake Superior. Another bonus. And again, I think it's very important to keep in mind that there are no broad and sweeping changes in this rule package. The fishing for fun, fishing as part of an economy, as part of an industry, and just fishing as a way of life just continues on uninterrupted with these rules and with the agreement. And so for that, I have to say that our negotiators on both sides did a very good job on this project. We appreciate the work that they did greatly. And with that, I'd be happy to answer questions. And if it's okay with the chair, I might look to some of our experts that we've got here too to help out a little bit. But we respectfully request adoption of these rules.
We are going to have a 2-minute or 3-minute break. We have a technology problem on our website, so we have to take a break. We'll break until 10 after. Okay. Good morning again. We're back live. We appreciate our communications team taking care of the problem because it's very, very important that we provide an opportunity for the citizens of Wisconsin and across America to see what we do here as a National Natural Resources Board and what our department does. So Scott hasn't left the room, thank you. So he's still here with us. So let's open it up for board member questions before we do our public participation, please. Doc?
Scott, I have a couple questions. You made a statement that the negotiations are private and closed to the public, that you went in negotiations knowing you would have to give in on some things. When most time we go negotiations knowing we have to compromise on some things. So with that map, which is today's result of the negotiations, what did the stakeholders that you represent, the state of Wisconsin stakeholders, what did they gain from the negotiations from the previous agreement?
Yeah, and so, of course, from the previous agreement.
Yeah, I mean, if you had an old map of before and now, what would be different for the stakeholders of Wisconsin in that negotiation? You made it clear that you knew you had to give in to something.
Yeah.
And if I negotiate, I want to make compromise and get something and give a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, and so and a lot of that is confidential, so I can't tell you, and fortunately, I don't know what went for what, but I point out that, how comparatively little change has occurred in that map. And, if you think about some of the other big things like improvement in lake trout allocation, and you think about some of the things that likely were on the table at the start, I think we actually think this is an extremely good agreement. It's not just a good deal. I mean, it is a really good deal compared to how things could possibly have turned out.
All right. Gary?
Yeah, first off, I want to thank the folks from the department that we're negotiating. I honestly don't know who they all are, but I'm sure it was many hours and many days. I also thank the chair for extending. I mean, as we all noted, when folks hear about it one day and they need to respond by 11 o'clock the next day after, there is information here that people have to digest. So I appreciate the chair making that extension. While it's not significant, when we hear things like a 3-month extension for the laboratory accreditation earlier today, I see that as major looking at things. I do understand that if this emergency rule goes through, there will be a time period for comments by the public before a permanent rule. Can you tell us, though, first of all, is there anything going to be valid out of that if there's negotiations that are ongoing right now? Would impact from the public between the emergency rule to the permanent rule have any? What could they do to make a difference?
Yeah, it potentially could. Certainly, we wouldn't be able to contradict the agreement. So a lot of issues in this rule, it would be very unlikely that we could change them. But then again, there are issues in the rule, like we've tried to create fairness between tribal commercial fishers and state commercial fishers. We don't necessarily have to do it that way with our commercial fishers, but certainly, what the tribal commercial fishers have, that we wouldn't be able to change, or we could be we could be breaking the agreement. But as I'm pointing out, there are some stateside things that theoretically could change. We'd probably be a little hesitant to do it, but it would be the hearing process that will happen. It's statutorily required. Is not purely an exercise, I guess, is what seems to be what you're asking in my response.
And a couple of follow-ups. One is you mentioned today in your testimony that there was a party of technical experts providing background and issues like that. Yet what has bothered the comments that we've received in this short time span, it really hit me when I looked through the documentation and saw this at least 4 times in the different pieces of information, and I'll quote, the rule may affect recreational anglers, but the exact impacts are difficult to predict. You mentioned we had a party of technical experts. Even when I look at that map or look at this, I see some things that really tell me that has some impact to recreational anglers. So I mean, maybe the scope of it is hard to predict. I mean, is it going to cause X amount of less fishing or something like that? But there are impacts here to the sports fisher, and we've heard about some of them in the documentation that we've received, the comments that we received. I also really have a trouble with the 5-year experimental season for whitefish. And that potentially has an impact. And when I read the documentation, it really talked about, this is a benefit to the state and tribal commercial. This provides them an opportunity during the spawning season to catch whitefish when they currently have that close. We have a really fine resource up there. It wasn't this way, I don't know how many years ago, but it's really grown into a fine resource that folks can use. I do worry about that impact of netting during that spawning season. Something has resulted in this population climbing. And it has climbed. I don't know what level it is. I don't see much science here talking about that. There's very little science, in fact, in this documentation. There's a little bit about lake trout because there is a population model. Obviously, we don't know that for the whitefish from, well, at least what I see here. Maybe there is some things. So I really worry about that 5-year experiment and not really having the justification behind it. From what I can see. Again, I don't have, I have to go with what the public gets and what I get. I don't think any of the board has anything else to say. And then we got a comment. So I'm hearing this as the comments from the public saying, hey, this isn't good, we don't like this. But we also heard from a state commercial fisherman in a comment that said they don't like it either. So who likes this experiment? It must be just the tribes then that like this experiment. I really worry about this. This is it's definitely an important resource out there, especially during the wintertime. And I realize I saw one thing, well, it's not going to affect the recreational fishers because they're allowed to fish year round. Well, honestly, whitefish fishing isn't done year round. And if you have data that says they're pounding the whitefish, the recreational people, on the spawning ground, let's see it, but I don't think it's there because it's primarily a winter fishery with a little bit of summer fishing, but kind of more incidental than anything. But it is a winter fishery like it is in the Green Bay area for sports.
Yep, agreed.
So I don't know. Could you comment on the 5-year experiment?
Sure.
I don't know, science or whatever behind it.
Right, and you're correctly observing that was something that was important to the tribes. So, we did want to extend it to the state commercial fishers just as a fairness issue, but it is important to them. I think they appreciate maybe just the less amount of effort that needs to be invested to catch their fish at that time of year. We have things that we were interested in there as well. So all you see related to whitefish in the rule are the season dates, basically. But we were interested in establishing a population model for whitefish. Well, we probably have the model already, but agreeing with the tribes on it, and then after that a quota for whitefish. And so that is something that has been agreed to in the agreement. I believe, and Cisco are another element to this as well, that the state commercial fishers do already have a quota. We don't have one specifically for whitefish, but for Cisco we do. The tribes do not, and so we were interested in everybody having a quota for both of those species. So it's kind of part of that group of issues. It was resolved that way. So going down the road, we believe we will have a quota. We've committed to developing the model and a quota, and that should result in good management of that species down the road, even though they're being harvested at that time of year. Another observation is whitefish are doing well up there. We heard that at one of our previous board meetings this year, and I was talking to our local Lake Superior biologist, Brad Ray, yesterday, and he was saying, we've been out netting, surveying, and their numbers are very good. We think they can sustain some October harvest. We of course, we'll be learning from this as well and modifying our regulations. He also observed that they're abundant, but their size is running a little smaller than normal. So, a possibility that there's competition for food out there. If you want to get into the science of a whitefish population model, I think Todd certainly could do that. I think that's something, though, that's still going to be developing as we work with the tribes over the next 5 years. But if you wanted to have a more general discussion about that, he's here and could do it. Otherwise, those are the points that are coming to mind for me on the issue of an October whitefish season.
Okay, thank you.
Bill?
Yeah, acknowledging and recognizing that the tribes have sovereign nation status and have hunting and fishing rights. In these negotiations, you hammer out a deal, right? And your side of the equation, you're required to make sure that there's a viable commercial fishing business in the Great Lakes, in addition to, making sure that the sport anglers have it good as well. So you negotiate a deal, and that's what you've done, right? So who monitors who monitors the provisions of this agreement to make sure that all parties are abiding with the agreement?
Certainly, so going down the road after everything is in place, who's monitoring? We will both be monitoring. Certainly
We will both.
Well, I should say, all the parties have law enforcement and biologist staff, and they're all going to be monitoring, each other.
Who enforces both parties? And I'm saying the DNR, the state of Wisconsin, and the tribes.
Yeah. So who oversees this? There's not like a federal body, that oversees it all. We are.
So everybody's on their own best behavior?
Well, no, everybody's monitoring each other. And if it's found that someone is in breach of the contract, then that would be illegal.
Activities over the folks that we regulate. There are also, I heard some questions about monitoring too, which is sometimes law enforcement based and sometimes biologically based. The agreement includes a number of provisions for the parties to jointly monitor commercial fishing that has happened. Each party also has to develop methods for monitoring angling that's occurring for the tribes. They also have to monitor home use fishing. That's a subsistence-based harvest that occurs. And so all of that is contained in the agreement. And then on top of that, all three parties, of course, employ biological staff who are regularly conducting assessment activities. Those biologists meet periodically throughout the year. They share their assessment data. They compare the different methodologies that they're using. And all of that is kind of correlated, sometimes in conjunction with federal agencies too, who help us with some of that science to make sure that we're all on the same page and that all aspects of this fishery are being looked at.
answer your question? The follow-up question, I think, to that, Chandra, is who reports to who? In other words, does the state of Wisconsin, do we all sit down together and say, okay, here's what's going on?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, how often?
There are a number of different ways in which this occurs. Of course, the parties communicate with each other on an informal basis throughout the year. The agreement also requires the parties to exchange a lot of very significant data throughout the whole fishing season. There are a lot of different reports that have to be generated, a lot of different assessments that need to be done, and all of that information is exchanged. The law enforcement folks are in regular communication with one another because, as you can imagine, a lot of these activities sometimes cross party lines, and so there's a great relationship there, a lot of cooperation. Our team of technical experts meets minimally 3 times a year, but usually it's quite more frequent than that. The current agreement includes some things that Scott mentioned, but some provisions for the parties to look at developing some new science, doing some new assessments, and so they'll be meeting very regularly to talk about those. And then the full negotiating team meets annually, and at that annual meeting, we discuss some of the findings of the biological committee, those technical experts. We get updates from law enforcement. We find out what's been working, what's not working. We update the lake trout quota at that time. And so the work doesn't end. This is really an ongoing effort that's happening throughout the year.
What happens if we violate the agreement?
Jake, would you like to answer? Okay. As with any agreement, there's always a potential that a violation could constitute a breach of contract, in essence. The agreement can be terminated by any party on that standard contract language in those circumstances. What would happen in that scenario is really speculation at best. It's hard for us to predict what the tribes might or might not do. I think with all breach of contract scenarios, there is a significant litigation risk. And then also, if there's no agreement, the regulations that the parties have agreed to enforce would theoretically no longer be required. And that would enable each party potentially to go its own direction. And that, of course, could have consequences.
So that would be in the federal court system if that was what happened, or the state court system?
That would depend on how the litigation would be initiated. It's really a complicated thing, and I'm not sure I could answer that without a specific fact scenario.
Okay, thank you.
Can you ask this question? So are there benchmarks put in place with this agreement to bring the parties back to the table? And if, let's say, for example, the harvest of whitefish was way more than we thought, and Wisconsin Department wants to cut the quotas, and the tribal says, no, we're okay with that for the next 7 years. Standstill? I mean, do both parties have to agree to a change in this thing?
There are a number of provisions throughout the agreement, depending on the issue, that absolutely do require the parties to come back together. The quota is a really good example for lake trout. The parties are required to recalculate that every 3 years. We do determine that jointly because it is a 3-party agreement, but I can tell you that in the history of the agreement, the quota has always been adopted as calculated. There are other provisions in the agreement that require the parties to come back together. There are a number of assignments I've mentioned that are tasked to the technical experts, and these are to look at things like developing that whitefish model, looking at that Cisco quota, trying to perfect that in the future. And so those are automatic requirements of the agreement. And then there's also just a catch-all that allows the parties to come back together anytime that there's a concern. We typically do that in our annual meeting because we gather data throughout the fishing season.
But you're mandating to come back together. If there's anything in the contractual language that says the parties, if one party decides not to make a change, it doesn't get, it's required 100% agreement to make a change in the agreement?
Yes, because 3 parties have signed the agreement. A formal amendment to the agreement would require all the consent of all 3 parties.
So there's a possibility that we would live with this for 10 years if some party decided to, one of the 3 parties decided to step out and not in good faith. There's nothing that forces a party to say we're going to adopt it. You say they have historically. There's nothing in the contract that says if this benchmark's made, if this quota is calculated that we need to adhere by it, it has to be a voluntary agreement to adjust the quotas? You understand my question?
I think I understand the question. I mean, the quotas are adjusted annually. They are just, or not annually, I'm sorry, every 3 years. They're recalculated based on a formula.
And they have to agree to that recalculation.
The parties, well, the old quota would expire, and so the parties do have to adopt a new quota.
For lake trout.
For lake trout, yes.
Not for white.
Kaz?
I'm somewhat, I think I want Chandra on this one. I'm somewhat familiar with the court decisions, read them a few years ago, but ultimately the state is responsible for the management and sustainability of our resources. Is that correct?
I believe the court case you're referring to is probably State versus Voight. And that court case was limited to determining issues related to inland treaty rights. Ironically, the parties to that litigation actually entered into a stipulation that specifically excluded Lake Superior from that litigation. And so that court case does not apply to Lake Superior, and rights related to Lake Superior have not been determined by a court.
But if we go by the precedent that ultimately the state has that responsibility, until that's tested in court, we have to believe that our job is ultimately the protection of the resource. And it kind of, models are actually made as predictors. We have a tendency in this agency to use models to tell us what's going on the ground, but models are typically made as predictors. So did we produce a model for that whitefish population going forward with the 5 years? Does anybody know that there's an actual?
The model is in the process of being developed for whitefish. The way that whitefish have been regulated historically is a little bit complex, and Todd can maybe jump in if I misstate anything. But I think it's a misconception that because there is no model currently for whitefish, that harvest is limitless. That's not actually accurate. Whitefish harvest is tied to the lake trout quota. So there's a lake trout quota every year that's updated every 3 years. And that quota determines the amount of net effort that an individual can fish. And that effort applies to whitefish harvest. In addition, both under the current whitefish season and the new October whitefish season, an individual would need to still have remaining lake trout quota in order to fish those nets. As soon as that lake trout quota is used up, the harvest is stopped. There's also effort limitations, both in the regular whitefish season and in the new October season, which help control that harvest. And those have proven to be effective controls on population harvest to date.
So the answer is no, we have no idea what impact that this 5-year season is going to have on the sustainability of whitefish. That's in essence the answer, because
I'm going to turn to the scientist on that.
The question is the chair.
Todd, would you answer the question, please?
Jerry Hilgenberg, Deputy Secretary, Natural Resources Board. So yes, to answer that question, but just to go back one, just real quickly, these negotiations were extremely complex. We worked with 3 entities that had their own goals, own objectives, very unique standards that they wanted to pursue. And however, there was one common foundation throughout those entire negotiations, and I sat through almost every single one of them. One common foundation. Every party was absolutely committed to preserving, sustaining, and enhancing the fishery resources for the current and future generations of Lake Superior. That was our common bond. We always went back to that. So I think it's important for this board to understand that that's what every party wants to do. We want to make sure that we preserve that fishery for current and future generations. In terms of the impact of the October whitefish fishery, the department does not feel that there would be a significant impact to the whitefish population for this experimental fishery. We feel that there are significant amount of regulatory provisions to protect that fishery from having negative impacts. Many of them you heard. You have to have lake trout tags in order to fish it. It's a 3-week fishery, so it's an experimental or fishery. It's a very short amount of time. There are certain areas that are restricted, so there are lake trout spawning areas where they can't even fish. They're limited in the amount of gear that they can use. They have to pull their gill nets within 48 hours. So there are numerous restrictions that give us comfort to feel that we don't feel that this 5-year experimental fishery will have a negative impact on the whitefish fishery. It's also tied to the development of a whitefish model, and we intend, all the parties have agreed to develop that model by 2021. And once we have that model, we'll use that model to inform whether or not that fishery should be continued in the future.
So Todd, question for you. If the fishery is jeopardized in year 2, what do you do?
If the fishery is jeopardized in year 2, I go back to the first statement that I said, that every party is absolutely committed to preserving and sustaining a good fishery in Lake Superior. So as you heard before, there are numerous times when the parties meet. So that this technical experts group that Chandra mentioned, they meet at least 3 times a year. The parties get together once annually. If something like that were to happen, the parties would discuss impacts, and we would work to address those impacts. If there were negative impacts that were impacting the fishery, the parties would get together and they would discuss options for addressing that issue.
Gary, and then Bill.
Todd, you mentioned one of the big kickers for this whitefish experimental season is that and Chandra said the same thing. There are tags, those that you can net, or those commercial fishermen that can net must have tags. Both state and tribal must have lake trout tags left.
Yep.
Do you have information how many of these you would expect? Would it 50% of the lake trout in the past has the lake trout quota been met by these folks by September? And there wouldn't be, or I mean, is everybody going to be out there, and do you anticipate everybody going to be out there in the spawning areas in October of the commercials, or probably 25% from any data that you have currently? The other worry I do have, and you can follow this up as you're thinking about that, is to have lake trout tags left. Lake trout tags are used on lake trout they take, not those off the side that they don't want, correct? So it's just the ones that you take. Are we sure that everybody's not going to? I mean, I know some deer hunters that are going to save some tags sometimes by, we're not going to do this now, we're going to do it later, and just so they can have that season. Any thought on that or concern about that either?
Yeah, so in terms of the lake trout tags, so in order to participate in the October whitefish fishery, you have to have lake trout tags available. And if you catch a lake trout, you're required to keep it. So they can't throw it back. So they have a tag, that they catch one, it has to go in the boat. So there's no releasing them. And in terms of the amount of activity we would potentially see, and Brad Ray is here too, we could potentially get into the specifics, but I know that the state commercial fishers they're very efficient with their tags, and they make them last throughout the entire season. And so it's very likely that there would be state commercial fishers that have lake trout tags left over, because the season runs, from December through the end of, now it'll go through the end of October. Normally it goes from December through the end of September. And they want to make sure that they have tags available during all the different unique times when lake trout fishing is good or not good. So they maintain that. So, an answer to your question is, we don't know exactly how many people would participate, but I can say that many of the commercial fishers will have lake trout tags left over at that time because they save them.
And last question, sorry, Bill. You read the comments from the chart,
Yes.
the state folks, commercial folks that didn't like this.
Yeah.
And they had some very valid points, as I read, at least in my, it appeared to me they had some valid points. Any comments on some of those things, or?
Yeah, and like you said, we really appreciate every comment and suggestion that we get. And there was one commercial fishing family that was concerned about the whitefish fishery. And although we acknowledge those concerns, we feel that there are enough sideboards, regulations, standards placed on this fishery that it won't have a negative impact through the experimental period.
They're the only ones that commented to us from a state commercial.
Right.
Do you have feelings from the other state commercial that they like this idea?
Yeah, so we so in terms of outreach, the Bad River Band approved of the agreement on Wednesday of last week. I drove up to Bayfield last week, and right after we found out that they had approved it, that was kind of our okay to start working and talking with stakeholders. And literally the minute after we found out, we started calling them. We started working with them and explaining what this means to folks. And we talked with all the commercial fishing families. And the ones that you're referring to, the letter that you got, that's the only commercial fishing family that we received concerns from about the October whitefish fishery. The other commercial fishers said they may or may not participate in it, but they didn't express significant concern about the fishery.
Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I know what's eating at us as board members is this. This is a pretty darn big deal that we're supposed to approve today. And there's probably good reason why it was dumped on the agenda at the 11th hour, but we have not had adequate time to do justice to making this decision. That's just how I feel.
Yes, sir.
Can you speak to, in labor relations, you find a grievance procedure?
Scott or Scott Loomis or Todd?
It's for staff.
Okay.
The answer may come from a couple of people. So in a grievance procedure, there are timelines and protocols. You're articulating that if something is amiss, that we'll get together at our annual meeting, we'll talk about it then, or there may be an impromptu meeting. Does this agreement codify a grievance type procedure where anybody could bring that to the fore to be dealt with at that time?
So yeah, I'll defer to legal on the grievance.
Thank you. I don't have the agreement in front of me, but I do believe that we included language in there that would allow the parties to bring any biological concern present at any point in time. That's always been the case, and there are times where the parties have gotten together outside of the annual meeting schedule to do just that.
Does that allow for the public to also weigh in, or just the two parties? Three parties?
It would depend on the circumstances. I mean, if there is something that's happening out there that is of concern, that we always engage the public through a variety of processes in those discussions. We often hear directly from the public, and we might conduct outreach of our own to hear what's going on. We'll combine that with our biological data, and we will use that to inform the discussions between the state and the two tribes. Any changes to the agreement do constitute a negotiations, and those do occur at that government-to-government level, but we work very hard to make sure that the stakeholder perspectives are brought to the table.
Julie, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to respectfully disagree with Mr. Bruins that this was thrown on the agenda at the last second. Nobody's aware of anything. It's a big shock. It's a big surprise. These tribal negotiations with these sovereign nations are, again, they said they're confidential. They're negotiated. It is highly complex because, as you all understand, the nature of the sovereign tribal entities. But the reason this is before us today is because the agreement has expired, and so something has to be done. So when looking at the comments and reading the comments that I went through, the option of let's table this, let's lay this over, or let's not take action right now, that's not an option. I don't believe. I think that this board has to do something, get something in place, because without it, there is nothing. And so, that's my 2 cents worth, but I think staff has done a very good job of explaining what they can in terms of what's gone into this, and the next steps. There are going to be next steps. There's going to be additional information coming forward. And I think that to Todd Kalish's comments that, there's a common thread and sort of a common theme amongst all the stakeholders in this saying they care about the fishery, they want to maintain that fishery, they want to preserve that fishery, not for just now, but for future generations, I think is a very important point. And I don't know who wouldn't want to. And so I think they've done a great job considering the fact that, again, you've got an agreement that's expired or expiring, so.
Thank you for bringing that up, Julie, because Jake is going to answer the question about what if we didn't do anything.
Yeah, well, I was just going to, I think that was a good summary by Julie, and just a point of clarification. The agreement's been signed, right? So as far as kind of what happens next, the agreement's already signed. The question before the board is the rules that effectuate certain terms of the agreement. Mr. Chair, what happens next? I think we would be in kind of an uncertain territory. There's obviously the potential for maybe some user conflict if there are rules not in place. And then there is litigation risk. And I think we've probably had a very good discussion about some of those risks, and I guess I would just advise the board that additional conversations probably would be better for one-on-one or closed session, because as Chandra alluded to, this is a very unique situation, because this is really essentially a stipulation and agreement from 1985, which I have here, that essentially carved out the Lake Superior portion of the negotiations from the Voight litigation. And so this is unique, and I appreciate kind of the frustration of maybe not being fully involved in some of those negotiations, but those are government-to-government communications, and there's almost, frankly, multiple layers of confidentiality in that. It's essentially a settlement agreement pursuant to litigation. Settlement agreements, as many of you know, are always confidential. I mean, we encourage settlement, and therefore we make those communications confidential. And then Chandra and others were involved. I was involved with direct communications with the attorney, and so there's going to be attorney-client privilege as well. So that's probably the best summary I can provide at this point.
Thank you, Jake. We will now have public appearances, please. As a reminder, for those that are coming before the board, we have 3 public appearances registered. You have 3 minutes each, and their buzzer will go off at 2 minutes and 45 seconds. You'll have 15 seconds to close. In our first public appearance, it must be George.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Deputy Secretary Eckert. Is it deputy or assistant deputy? Yes. Okay, thank you. Representing Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, you will hear a little bit later Mr. Scott Bredding, who represents the Possum Island Sport Fishing Association, one of our affiliates. We represent a lot of sport fishermen on Lake Superior. And we are concerned about, I'm going to talk about the process. You're going to hear more about the substance from the next 2 speakers. And just starting out, I have, and our organization have a great deal of respect for the difficulty of the department staff position in negotiating this agreement. I was involved in, this goes back to the Gurno decision, which preceded the Voight decision by 20 years. I was the attorney that negotiated, was part of the team that negotiated the second agreement on Lake Superior, the Gurno decision. And of course, I did 100 separate agreements, on interim agreements, on the Voight litigation. And I can tell you, the department is in a much more difficult position negotiating on Lake Superior than it is on the inlet. And that's because the litigation gave better guidelines in Voight as to how the resource will be allocated in the rules. There was just a declaration of what the right was in Gurno without more detailed. So it's much more complicated negotiations, and I appreciate the staff's effort. What I am concerned about is the process and how, in fact, it's reflecting on the positions and the concerns and, candidly, the acceptance or lack of it, by the sport fishermen in the Lake Superior area and on the board and the department as a result. There are 4 years of negotiations, and we understand that this week, last week, the last tribe adopted the agreement. I can guarantee you that the tribal commercial fishermen had input every time, at every session, and before had a chance to know what the details were before it was approved by the tribe. The state fishermen don't have that kind of access, or didn't have that kind of access. So it gets adopted by the Bad River Tribe as the last tribe, following their process, and then the state has this problem. Your board meeting is this week. Staff started calling some of the fishermen, some of the leaders, on Thursday noon. If I can finish, please. And in fact, as a result, there's still sport fishermen that don't even know this agreement was reached. They surely don't know the details. You have some of the leaders that do. I informed our vice president about this agreement. He's a guide. I informed him at 9:30 on Friday with a deadline at that time of 11 o'clock. Even the extension, and we appreciate that, took it to Monday. There's a lot of sport fishermen that have not had a chance to provide comments on what this is about. We're asking that you go have department staff go up, hold a meeting, and explain what the situation is before you make a decision. It will, I think, be much more respectful of parties that are really seriously impacted on this. Yes, there is some risk, but the department can go to the tribes and explain, because of the schedule of board meeting, we didn't have a proper chance to provide information, and we asked them, the graces, to delay a vote on this. Thank you very much.
Any questions for George? Thank you, George. Our next speaker is Scott Bretting, please, from Ashland.
Good morning. Thanks for allowing me to speak. My name's Scott Bretting. I own River Rock Inn and Bait Shop in Ashland. I'm also the president of the Apostle Island Sport Fishing Association. I also hold a U.S. Coast Guard captain's license, and I've been a licensed sport fishing guide on Lake Superior for several years. I'm not in favor of approving this emergency order. The agreement will impact the Ashland, Mayfield County communities severely over the next 10 years. I also got to apologize to James Yock for my scathing email last week that I wrote about this process. It wasn't personally intended, but he did write a letter that said that we're going to have time for possibly correcting some of this and maybe changing some of it in a public comment period. But it sounds like it's a done deal. The main issue that I'm going to speak about today, though, is the blue area up there and the whitefish fishery. That blue area, 90% of the fish are in 10% of the water. And that blue area up there is one of our main high sport fishing areas and is a high traffic area used by our nearshore fishing, small boat traffic fishing. And it's a premier fishing area. And without that, you're going to impact our economy severely. It's going to impact from our big box stores of Walmart and L&M all the way down to negatively impacting my personal store. I sell, bait and tackle, and I also sell fresh fish, smoked fish, and it's going to devastate our local restaurants, hotels, motels. As you expand the commercial fishery in the proposed areas, it's like putting a fence up. The small boats are going to have to get to the other side of that fence. they're not going to come to the Ashland area if they're not going to have success. So you're going to devastate the economy to the area for the tourism. We've been trying to build that. My phone's been ringing off the wall from the local chambers, from all the local sports fishing groups, all the local outdoor groups saying, hey, what's going on? How can we fight this? I also have a letter that I received from the other bait shop owner, Carolyn Schwartz, that also begs you to look at this and assess what the impact's going to be on local community. And we're building a new whitefish fishery that's growing. I'm putting in new tackle to fish the winter whitefish fishery. And if we're going to experiment with it and wipe it out, what's the impact going to be in the area? And you guys are saying we're going to assess it and experiment with it? Well, experiment with my business too? You're going to say good luck? Thanks for the time.
Questions for Scott, please? Bill?
So if you could wave your magic wand and revert back to the old agreement, would that be more acceptable than what we're looking at now?
You know, I built my business model on what the current agreement is. I've worked with it. We've worked around it. And I'm growing. I've had success with it. I'm still in business. I started in 2007. I'm still in business today. There's a new L&M store in Ashland. Ashland's cleaned up their Superfund site, putting in some new boat launch facilities. They're expanding their marina. There's a new hotel in Ashland.
And that's pretty much, you think, all driven off of
tourism,
the existing agreement that was in place, which has allowed this to happen.
It's driven off of tourism. And tourism in our areas all has to do with that lake, and all has to do with the main attraction is fishing.
Thank you, Scott. Our next presenter is Daryl Fenner. Morning, Daryl.
Good morning. Thank you.
Did you get my message?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Appreciate that. My name is Daryl Fenner, owner of D Superior Fishing Charters in Washburn, Vice President of Apostle Island Sportfish Association. I am not in favor of this approval of this emergency regulation. If approved today, the state tribal agreement will be enacted for the next 10+ years. DNR does not understand how this agreement will affect local sport fishery and has said so in its own analysis, and I quote, "This rule may affect recreational anglers, but the exact impacts are difficult to predict." While I agree with many parts of this agreement, there are several areas where I have strong concerns, and that will affect sport fishermen. Western Long Island and Southern Madeline Island will be opened up to commercial fishing year-round. This is one of the most popular sport fishing areas due to its close proximity to Ashland Bayfield area. This will expand commercial fishing opportunity, but will result in a loss of sport fishing opportunity. Although sport fishing is allowed, high-efficiency nets will reduce fish populations significantly in these areas, and as a result, sport fishing success will be very poor. As a charter fisherman, I will need to travel much further to fish net-free areas, increasing my costs significantly. Fishing offshore reduces the number of days that I can fish due to weather, increases safety risk to my passengers, and will impact my fishing success as well as my profitability. Sport fishermen need nearshore areas free from commercial fishing to provide safe, quality fishing opportunity. My second point, extending the whitefish season through the month of October. This is lake trout spawning season. Spawning trout need to be protected from harassment by netting, and it's even opposed by some commercial fishermen. Third point, Van Tassel's Point area to include open water netting November 28th to March 31st. In the past agreement, this area was only available for netting during the ice season. Open water netting will significantly increase commercial harvest of whitefish and reduce the sport fish harvest. Currently, sport fishermen harvest less than 2% of the overall harvest of whitefish. Result, another lost sport fishing opportunity. 4, no safe harvest level for whitefish has been determined. While each change in this agreement from the past appears minor, and that map is slightly wrong, and if you ask me a question about it, I'll tell you, when combined, all will reduce sport fishermen's opportunity to utilize the fishery. This agreement will have an economic impact on sport fishing, related businesses, and tourism. I ask that the board not approve this emergency regulation, as approval will implement a poor agreement for the next 10-plus years. I ask that DNR reopen negotiations with the tribes to incorporate concerns of sport fishing as well as other user groups. I ask that our sport fishing opportunity be preserved and enhanced through renegotiation of this agreement. Thank you.
Questions for Joe? Yes?
You got me curious about the map.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you for asking. So, that map shows the blue area and the red area is being changed from the past agreement. That red area there, to the north of that whole area along Madeline Island, was changed 3 years ago in a minor renegotiation to keep the tribes from netting within the refuge areas. So what that did was include a whole area open to that was closed for commercial fishing, opened it up 3 years ago. Now it's being said, well, there's not really much of a change because we're adding this little red area there, but it actually adds that whole area along southern Madeline Island in the last 3 years. So I don't know if I explained myself clearly, but...
No, I think you did.
Okay.
Thank you, Darrell.
Thank you.
Terry. First press, then Doc.
This is, I'm sorry. There's always this yin and yang with the commercial fishing group and the sports fishing group. The openness and transparency question has to get answered. So I'd ask staff to give us a snapshot as to the openness and transparency that several folks who've come before us said that wasn't there. And I think the board then has an opportunity to weigh in, not only on the merits of the agreement, but was there actually openness and transparency?
Scott?
So, let's see, openness and transparency is in how we communicated with the sport anglers prior, and during negotiations. So, like maybe I would ask Todd to talk, or Brad Ray, about our communications with those groups. And, yeah.
Yeah, so good question, Preston. So as you've already heard, these are government-to-government negotiations. So we need to respect that process. However, it's absolutely critical that we appropriately characterize and carry forward the wants, the needs, the issues of the stakeholders that we represent. And so you've heard that we've been negotiating this for the past 4 years. Over the past 4 years, we have convened 2 stakeholder meetings a year to update stakeholders on, in general, the process. And we can't share information with stakeholders in terms of exactly what we're negotiating on, but in those 2 meetings every year for 4 years, we would ask them, what are your priorities? What are your issues? What are your concerns? What do you want to make sure that we integrate into this rule? So we did that. That was one thing. Another thing we've done is that I think this board is familiar. We're pursuing a lake, well, you are familiar, I presented the scope statement. We're pursuing a Lake Superior fisheries management plan. And so we've had 7 public meetings with stakeholders up in Lake Superior. And through those meetings, we've learned more about and incorporated, we've learned more about what their wants are, what their needs are, what their concerns are. We also have numerous public meetings. This board has has weighed in on the lake trout seasons, the Cisco trout, the Cisco quota. That was 2 years ago, so we've had numerous meetings with Lake Superior stakeholders regarding that issue. Also, and we've got, Brad Ray, the biologist, in the audience today, our staff has an integral and very close connection with the stakeholders up there. Those folks, if they've been to the Bayfield office, if you haven't, I encourage you to go there. But there's an open door in that Bayfield office. They regularly communicate. They regularly walk in and out of that Bayfield office on a regular basis. They are talking with those folks on a daily basis. They understand what the concerns, what the wants, and what the needs are. In addition, after Bad River signed off on the agreement, we started contacting stakeholders. So Wednesday night through Thursday, we contacted as many stakeholders as we possibly could in those 2 days to let them know what the agreement was like. We have also committed to convening 3 public meetings as a result of, we're following the emergency rule process. Within 45 days, we have to have 1 public hearing. We're going to have 3 public hearings in January. We're going to have 2 in addition to the 1 that's regularly required. So we're not only communicating and understanding stakeholders' issues prior, but we're also working through the process with them as we work through the emergency rule process.
Thank you. I have a question for George. George, as I think you've been secretary like 8 or 10 times now, right?
One very enjoyable period.
How does the impact of confidential negotiations, would it upset the apple cart if these agreements are shared broadly where nothing is able to get accomplished and there has to be some sort of confidentiality going forward? Is your issue the confidentiality of the substantive nature of the agreement, or this timing issue of we're ready to go now and we've talked to people, we've had a lot of conversation with it? The unfortunate part of this conversation is it's been stifled somewhat because now it's before us and people may not have enough time. What's your gist as to having the public in the middle of your negotiations?
There clearly is a confidentiality issue. We had that on the Voight decision. How we handled it, and to some extent, Todd talked about it, is you have meetings with your groups before you get into the negotiating room to see what's important. So that is important. What I think, and I can't answer this question, but those going into those restricted areas was a surprise to sport fishermen. And you heard from our 2 representatives from the Apostle Island Sport Fishing Club. They had not had input into whether or not those restricted areas would be gone into, and those are bread and butter areas, as you heard. So I think that's where the breakdown took place. The reason I asked that there be meetings, even if it takes asking the tribe, give us a little more time, is to go up and explain the situation more. I mean, there's a bunch of people up there that don't even know about this, and they're going to get more, they're going to be very upset when they learn. I think that can help the situation. And you're in a very difficult position. That part of it is the juxtaposition of when the sport meeting fell compared to when the Bad River tribe did. If it was 2 weeks from now, DNR could have been up there and probably, I suspect, would have held a meeting rather than just going through their phone Rolodex or whatever on it. But there is confidentiality to it. But I don't know if the questions weren't asked, or maybe the sport fishermen didn't realize that was even going to be on the table because it's such an important area to them. I don't know where that broke down because I wasn't involved in it, but that's what I think is going on.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
We'll have staff address that.
Okay. Doc?
Scott, please. Or no, actually, Jake. So, Jake, my question is it kind of talks about the process and where we're at, and to address Julie's concerns as well. I have a really difficult time with this when we have no choice. You were forcing us to make a vote here. Otherwise, all things could happen. And when you make the statement that what's already been signed, Is that statement accurate, that agreement's been assigned, anything we do here today, table it, turn it down, prove it, doesn't affect the fact that the agreement's been signed? That's my first question.
Yeah, and that was my I guess what I wanted to clarify was there's kind of two components here. There's an agreement and there are the rules that are in front of you that effectuate certain terms of the agreement.
Okay, so
the agreement has been signed.
If you're on the negotiation team for the state with this, working on it for 4 years, and you know that a company's got to happen for this to really be palatable by the NRB board, wouldn't you want at least in confident, I mean, I believe we have the right as a government agency to go in closed session for certain litigation. I know we're not part of the confidential negotiation team, but we are a government body. So maybe we're not the government body that negotiates this agreement, but we're certainly a government body that you need us to approve this emergency rule to really put this thing in play. Nothing to us, no closed session, no briefings. It's like, there it is. And you put our back against the wall, big time. And I don't appreciate it personally. I do not believe, contrary to what Todd said, if the sports fishermen really knew what was going on with this, you can say that they've been talking for 4 years, but everybody I call, this is like out of the blue, what the heck's going on? And now we sit here and we got a couple options. We can either table it, which may give the department time to go up to Ashland and talk to the people and lay out what's happening, come back and approve it next month. If we turn it down, we're basically saying to your negotiation team, well, the agreement we signed, we can't get the order through, it's chaos. Or we approve it with, I feel, very little time for us to give input or get testimony for or against the agreement. Now, the difference is here, what's confusing is we're not debating the agreement as much as we are the emergency rule that you need to put in effect to make the agreement work. Is that correct?
Well, first, I don't think I would describe it as chaos.
Well, if you
I said there would be some gray areas that we'd have to navigate and some uncertainty.
Okay, so let's play that out. We turn it down today. What happens? There's no agreement in place. It expires, I take it. What is the expiration date? Is it now?
The agreement has expired.
Okay,
and we
so
now have a new agreement in place.
If we don't put this in place today, okay, chaos maybe is a rough word.
Just to be clear, the rules.
Maybe chaos is the wrong word. Okay, what's going to happen? I assume the state of Wisconsin would continue under their present rule, even though they got this agreement signed out here that they just did, but our other rule would be in play as far as regulation with the sports fishermen and the citizens that are non-tribal members. Is that correct?
I think we'd probably want to have discussions with some of the parties to maybe decide on what those next steps are, because one of the risks may be that the three parties simply decide to, and I think Chandra pointed this out, that have their own rules, have their own methodology for kind of implementing.
Can you explain to me why you would have a closed session with us to discuss this prior to open approval of emergency rule that's needed for your agreement to really play out?
Well, as I think others have pointed out, the timing on this was, I don't want to say last second, but we were certainly negotiating the terms of the agreement until the last hour. Some of us were having phone calls over the weekend before, and so frankly, I think this was just a timing issue, and obviously we have to notice things properly for this board in order to go into closed session. And so the reality is, and again, I hesitate to really get into actually how these negotiations played out because they are confidential, but I can say the staff did a very good job of actually getting this to a place where, and I'm really hesitating here, but about 2 to 3 months before this was finalized, that we had things in a very good place. And as typically negotiations go, there was some disagreement over kind of one of the final terms. And so I think, frankly, that's probably something the board should know, is that I think staff did a good job of getting things into place well before we needed to. And again, as many of you know that are involved in business and other government agencies, negotiations can be fickle, and there was some last-second disagreement, which resulted in a delay.
Well, I'll make a statement for the record. The agreement that we have for the sports fishermen puts them in a box. It definitely is a game changer. You can make it only a couple acres, 29 acres, but it is the classic line, 10% of the fish are 9% of the fish in 10% of the water. All that area is really close to Ashland, Wakefield Bay. It's all right there. That's where all the people from Wisconsin that fish in Lake Superior, that's where they go. So that little agreement that you signed already changes the sportsman's allocation and access to that body of water.
Jake, question for you. This is a follow-up to Doc's questioner's point. If we do not do anything with this rule, right now, we have a rule in place, correct?
Expired.
No, it's expired.
No, the agreement expired.
Yeah, no, that's a good question.
Our rule is still, whatever rules we have been adhering to would continue.
Right.
So it's probably technically correct to say that the rule still exists, but again, the problem is, it's kind of step one, you have an agreement, step two, the rules effectuate the agreement. The previous agreement that the rule that you're referring to is attached to has expired. So the rule itself is likely still would be on the books, but there's no agreement that serves as a foundation. We now have the new agreement, and then now the rules are in front of you.
But Wisconsin fisher persons would have to be abiding by the existing rule until a new rule is adopted.
Correct.
The other parties to the old agreement, they don't have to. But our people, our Wisconsin residents, would have to abide by the existing current rule.
Yes, but again, the problem is the foundation for those rules are an expired agreement.
Sure. No, I understand
And so
that.
we'd have some, I think it would put some of our, frankly, wardens in a difficult position because they may not have the legal authority with an expired agreement. And that's why I think it is important that with this new agreement, we have some rules in place so that our wardens have the legal authority and other individuals involved in the process to actually enforce the terms of the agreement.
But the only legal authority they have is over Wisconsin fishers, which is
Correct.
what the current rule is.
Correct.
Yeah. Bill?
Jake, this is for you too. Is there any legal way that we could suspend discussion on this and go into closed session?
No, we haven't properly noticed it.
Okay.
Kaz?
I have one question. I'd like a little historical background on that area to the north that one of our speakers talked about that was opened up 3 years ago. So that was something that occurred during an agreement, apparently an agreement that was in place. Is there somebody here that could give us a little background on that?
So that must have been the process, Kaz, you're talking about Madeline Island there, and
Right.
how did they amend the agreement to affect that?
Brad Ray, DNR fisheries biologist up in Bayfield. Thanks for letting me speak. The area that Darrell referred to is known as Hagen's Beach Restricted Area. 3 years ago, when the agreement was expired originally, the 2005 to 2015 agreement expired, there was an extension that was negotiated to extend it for 1 year. That extension changed some things, and one of the things it took was that Hagen's Beach area that was closed to commercial fishing from June 1st to August 15th was no longer there. It came to this board and was passed as a part of a rule process when Terry Martineau came down. Does that explain it?
So in essence, that's actually part of this agreement now. That temporary extension is now part of this agreement.
That aspect is,
Right.
yes.
Further comments and questions?
One last
Here.
comment, just to,
Doesn't have to be last.
for me. But folks, when you look at that map, I think Doc mentioned it, and it's very true. I've driven boats out there sport fishing.
Me too.
And when the nets are in an area, when their nets aren't in the area, and honestly, I went I've gone right through that area, because in the summer, when you're going lake trout fishing, you're going out that way. You're not going to go in that bay. It's too warm for the most part. So you're going to go out that way. And that's where you start setting your lines out. And we because there are no nets to deal with out there where you can start catching your fish. So that Hagen's Beach area, all of a sudden now there was more nets. And I believe now, Todd, if Todd, could you ask, I saw something about a change in the distance between nets now. Is that true, or a quarter mile? Is that right? That's in
Quarter mile, yeah.
Is that tribal or
Both.
state? So, I mean, that's significant even. I mean, every quarter mile, you got to kind of avoid and figure out, I mean, that was my part, is I'm not that familiar with the country, so all of a sudden, here's a buoy, there's a buoy, there's a buoy. Oh my gosh, now I got to pull nets or pull lines because I don't have a clue where I am and where these nets are. And that becomes a problem out there in that area when you just keep adding areas that are. But you said, could you just explain that, the quarter mile thing? That's, I believe it's changed, hasn't it, or not? Or isn't that distance for nets?
I think it was the same in the last agreement, wasn't it?
Was it the same? Okay.
I don't.
believe you were taking it to half a mile. I believe you made no change to that rule.
Yeah, we did not.
Okay, it was a quarter mile. I saw it listed as a quarter, and I was just shocked. I was hoping it was longer than that. That's all.
Todd, can you reflect back on what Scott said? The blue area is what?
So the blue area is going to be open to Bad River commercial fishers, gill nets only. And just to put that into context, there's 4 Bad River fishers, and so there's not that many. So that's only available to Bad River fisher gill nets. The red area would be open to state or tribal commercial fishing.
Are these large fish gill nets?
Yes. Yeah, and just a point of clarification too. So, you know, we heard that there was a miscommunication, and there wasn't a miscommunication. We know that this was going to be an issue. We knew that this was going to be an issue. That was very clear to us. We also know that there are many other restricted areas. There are many other very popular areas that we discussed in the process of negotiations that we're not talking about right now. So there was no breakdown in communication. We knew this was going to happen. We feel that in these very complex negotiations, there's gives and takes, and this entire package, you've got to think of this as one big package. We feel that given the large package and the focus on the sustainability of the fishery, we feel that this is an appropriate agreement.
Jake, one more time, please, for clarification.
Jake, please.
Because we're getting close to coming up with some consensus here, I hope. Tell me if this is summarized correctly. We passed the motion, the agreement's in effect, we already signed it, but the rule that supports your agreement would be in effect, correct? Mm-hmm. If we table the motion, the board then tables it till they want to bring it back off the table, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 months, there's no timeline constriction, and when we bring it back off the table, correct? Mm-hmm. And if we do table the motion, would that send a message back to the negotiation team that, you know what, we signed this, but it's struggling at our level with the rule that supports it? Would that happen, or would nothing happen in the department if we table this motion? Or can you not address that in open session?
I think we would certainly convene and decide on what the appropriate next steps are. So I'm not going to say nothing would happen.
I think you have to give them guidance. If you're going to hold it, you got to give them guidance.
Well, the testimony there, which I would think would bring the guidance that.
But you would tend to think that.
Right. Okay, and if we turn.
What I've heard is that you got to give the sport fishermen an opportunity to be heard. Well, they would certainly understand that the agreement's been signed, but there may be some changes to the rules that lean towards their agreement outside of the written agreement. Maybe there's a change to our specific rule that they're looking for versus opening up the agreement. But it seems that openness and transparency at best and the timeliness to the board are creating a significant problem for the administration.
And the third question then is, if we turn the motion down, would that send a stronger message back to the negotiation team that this is not going to pass or did not pass? You can bring it back up for reconsideration, another agenda item, but if we turn it down, it's out of our hands. We've said no to the department. Which do you think, based on today's testimony, and maybe you should talk amongst your team, would the department rather have if passing was not an option?
And we may want to recess to allow them to have a conversation.
It's up to chair.
I can just, I guess, offer an observation. Certainly, by tabling the motion, I think that gives, provides additional time for, maybe some changes to be made to the rule, and obviously, then they have to be properly noticed for a future meeting. Voting the rules down, I think would put the department in a difficult position.
Other comments and questions?
I guess one other.
15-minute recess. So, we had a little powwow by staff. Does staff want to give us a little guidance, please?
Thank you, Chair. I think we did have a good conversation, and I guess there's maybe just one point we want to emphasize, and I think Chandra is probably the most articulate person to do that.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hilgenberg, members of the board. Again, thank you for the opportunity to convene and discuss amongst ourselves. We had some very thoughtful conversation. We've heard the feedback that were provided by the members of the public. We've considered it carefully along with the feedback that we've gathered throughout this process. It remains the department's recommendation that the board does adopt these rules. Ultimately, this is the board's decision, of course. However, as was previously mentioned, the negotiations have concluded and the agreement has been signed. If the board were to table this agenda item or vote down the rules indefinitely, nothing really changes with respect to the agreement. It remains in place and the negotiations remain concluded. I suspect there may be a hope that if the board were to delay consideration of this issue, that would reopen the negotiations. That's not something the department can do unilaterally. That would require agreement by the two tribes, and from their perspective, again, the negotiations have concluded, and we don't think that would be a palatable option. So if the board were to table this or vote the rules down, we would stress again that we would be entering into a gray area. It's not certain what exactly the two tribes might do. We would know that we would not be able to uphold our end of the bargain with respect to the agreement, which does put us in a potential breach of contract scenario, and that would pose a significant litigation risk. As with all litigation, it's very difficult to know what the potential outcome is. However, it remains the department's position that this is a very fair and balanced agreement that really is the best that we can do and a better outcome than the alternative.
Questions for Chandra? Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you have this issue before you, 2B2. Pleasure. Doc, please.
All right, so as stated before, I'm hopeful that future boards won't be put in the same position we're put in. Publicly, I'd like to state that I wish the NRB would have been brought along the process a little bit during negotiations as far as where we're at. I do not believe that the agreement is in the best interest for the sports fishermen of Wisconsin. I think that's pretty clear by testimony today. But with all that said and the dust settles, we have a responsibility to move forward with the restraints that we have with the contractual obligations that the department has already signed. And let me be clear, they signed that with their court-appointed right to do that. It's not like they did something wrong. It's just the way the negotiations go with the sovereign nation. Now, we will be passing, if we pass this today, emergency rule. And I know, Sandra, you state that there's nobody opening this up, but I would hope that after today's testimony, that during the emergency rule hearings, the sportsmen have a chance to be heard. I hope the sportsmen aren't frustrated and think it's going to fall on deaf ears, that it's the done deal, like you said. Even though it may be a done deal, perhaps the other parties in the agreement may come back to the table and take some of the concerns that the citizens of Wisconsin are clearly voicing today and the frustration the NRB board has had with those concerns. So, reluctantly, I move that we adopt Board Order FH0118E for emergency proposed rules affecting NR 20 and 25 related to the harvest management in Lake Superior fishery.
Second.
There's a motion and a second for 2B5. Preston.
Doc, is there a way that we could codify our thoughts in a letter to all parties about our concern going forward as it relates to sports fishing piece? I mean, we've said it here, but it's something that you could also work with Terry to send a letter about our concerns.
I think it'd be great if all three parties, well, obviously the state knows our concern, they sat here today, but I think that'd be really a good opportunity. I mean, we meet with the tribes every year and we break bread with these people, and they're all citizens as well. And I think they sometimes, talking to the department members, even though they represent the citizens, it'd be nice for them to hear from our perspective and the testimony of the concerns they have with the present agreement. Like Sandra says, I doubt they're going to change, but I think that letter, if I was a tribal member and I sat down and read this letter, perhaps to bring it back to the table during the emergency rule process and hearings and modify a little bit for some of the concerns for sports fishermen. This is a big deal up there in Ashland. This is like putting a fence around their access to that lake in some respects. And the biggest concern is the small boats, Preston. If you got a small boat, you aren't going way out in the Apostle Islands. So they probably know that, but I would hope that, Terry, that you would compose a letter, and I'd be willing to help you compose it. I'm sure department staff would consolidate our thoughts and send that during the emergency rule process to the parties and see if it initiates some support to get back together.
So, Scott, you can start writing, please. Kaz?
I have a couple areas here. The negotiating process, in my opinion, is what put us in this situation. And there was a tactic used here to wait till the 9th hour to sign that agreement before our existing agreement expired. And in the future, we need to put a deadline on these negotiations 2-3 months ahead of time. And if they don't meet the deadline, then they're stuck with the old one. Because we can't make decisions like this and leave the public out of the loop. That's been a concern that the public's had forever. And it turns into these social conflicts that, in essence, we're creating. And I don't think that's the way we should go. The social aspect of this type of thing is always going to be difficult, but I'm more opposed to it, to the concept, because we don't have good sound science here. We think in our best estimation it's not going to impact populations. That's not good enough. That's not science to me. Models should have been done. We had 3 years to work on models. If we're going to start a model now, we don't even have a baseline we're working off of to start that model at this point in time. So I'm really concerned about the resource and lack of science that was involved in this agreement. That being said, it is a temporary rule, and maybe we can have people go back to the negotiating table and get a few things tweaked around the edges here that make the board feel more comfortable when that permanent rule comes forward.
Terry, respond real quick, Kaz. I think that's important. I left that out. I think the department realizes that if this passes, that we're this close to not passing it or tabling it. The same thing can happen 2-3 months when it comes back to us. We have to approve the permanent rule. This is by no means a rubber stamp of the permanent rule. And that's why I hope the department can take back to the table along with the letter from us and say, you know what, we really have to address a couple of concerns here, otherwise we risk of going through this all again, which we are going to do this all again. Right. We're going to be sitting here in 3 months, the same thing.
Are you and Kaz and Gary asking for some type of modeling as it relates to the impact on the harvest of whitefish?
Gary?
Gary, as our
Yeah, well-
representative, biometrician, I would tell you.
Yeah, no, I think even the department and the folks negotiating see this as a goal. My problem, and I agree totally with Kaz, is we're playing games here without knowing really. We're assuming that the population that is pretty high now is going to withstand everything. I heard the quote today that, the size of the whitefish is decreasing. Well, what's the explanation for that exactly? And that may be a start of a concern already, that, hey, the size is going down, is the forage there for them, things like that. So I would agree that, and I think the staff is cognizant of the fact that we do need better info and better data. I just also worry that sometimes we're making these major decisions, and I'm not sure we have enough science to do that at this time.
Well, then we should follow science. So
Always follow it.
I would ask that a note be in the record by the time it comes back to us that modeling has occurred after the impact. Anybody from the DNR staff opposed to that at all?
Todd, please.
No, I mean, that's a very good comment, very good request, and, if the board approves the emergency rule today, we will come back for the permanent rule with additional information, data, and science to support this recommendation.
Thank you.
I have one question, Paul.
Yes.
Do we have any idea what the catch would be for that season? Any rough idea?
For the October whitefish season, it all depends on how many people are going to actually do it. So what we could come back with for the permanent rule is have a thorough discussion with the commercial fishers and try to press them. We already pressed them to see if they were going to participate, and they kind of said, well, maybe not. And we can ask them to get a better inclination of who is going to participate, who isn't, and then based off that, make some estimates about what the harvest would be.
And how about a quota on it?
So a quota.
Is that potentially available in the future during this 10-year or 5-year experiment?
Well, yeah, all three parties have committed to developing a quota by 2021 for whitefish.
Other questions, comments?
My comment is, it still bothers me when I heard the original testimony said we kind of went into negotiations with determining to limit the amount we had to give up. And I think the sports fisher, I don't see much the sports fisher is really gaining on this. That's just my personal.
Okay, thank you. Ready for the vote?
Roll call, please.
Roll call, please. Lori? Everybody understands the motion? Is that a yes?
Yes.
Okay.
William Bruins.
Yes.
Julie Anderson.
Aye.
Dr. Frederick Frame.
Yes.
Greg Kazmierski.
Reluctantly, yes.
Gary Zimmer.
No.
Preston Cole.
No.
Terry Hilgenberg.
A reluctant yes. I believe the motion carries. I believe the department is on record now understanding what our concerns are, and that we need better data, better process.
Mr. Chairman, could
Yes.
I make a recommendation? I think we should have a representative of the board, who's also the department, in these future negotiations. Is that legally possible?
I think it's something we could definitely consider. And I think Chandra would probably agree with this, that would be something we'd want to talk to the parties. But obviously, the board has a very important role as a citizen board representing the state. And so I don't want to give you a definitive yes, because again, even who's in the room, who's part of the communications is negotiated. But I would like to think that that's a suggestion we could make. I don't see really any public meeting issues if you're just simply there to, represent the board. But again, it's something I think we should definitely consider.
Okay, Press?
There's always a fine line between the DNR secretary role and our role. I think, Kaz, you're tipping into the role of the DNR secretary. Now, as an observer, that's one thing. But to offer action in negotiations is, I think, beyond the board's purview. And quite frankly, is in the field of the secretary and their staff. But again, the observer piece that would add value, that's fine. I think you will find it, interesting. But where do you stop when this negotiation and the next negotiation and the next negotiation? So I would only caution us as to be careful for what you wish. And again, there are some clear lines as to the role of the secretary and the role of the board.
Bill?
I think it'd be way more beneficial if the department would utilize closed sessions
Here you go.
in a much more aggressive way.
See, being at the table, I think, is a part of the actual operation and execution. But Preston, they clearly need this board to finalize and stamp that, and I think they did not a very good job of bringing us along for the ride till the last hour, and I think that can be changed.
Since part of my other life is negotiating, consistency of the players is very important. The commitment that you would have to make outside of the conflict between our role and the department's role would be substantial. And when and who this might be, none of us might be here. So I would be cautious to get on that playground. But I do agree with Bill's statement that in this type of situation, briefings in closed session would be most appropriate.
So
That being said, we're done with this issue. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for their participation and their hard work with this. Now I got a fun thing to do. This is not on the agenda, but I'm going to do it anyway. All this year, the department has been recognizing DNR at 50.